It's great to be talking to you, Sally Mcmanus. There's been a lot of stuff in the news in the last few days about different allowances and supports to keep people working during this really difficult time. Can you tell us a little bit, first of all, about this new JobKeeper announcement that they made a couple of days ago?
Yeah, so for about nearly a month, the ACTU has been calling for wage subsidies, and that's effectively what JobKeeper is. Everywhere from the UK to New Zealand to Denmark, have introduced wage subsidies, and it was the thing that put the stop on job losses. And after the government made the announcement about Job Seeker, which was good, like a doubling of New Start, it did send a signal to a whole lot of employers that somehow it was okay to let people go. And no one had really thought through that consequence, or the fact that once you lose connection with your job and your work, it's much harder, obviously, to get back into work. So effectively, what they've announced is it's $1,500 a fortnight. You would get it if you're stood down, and stood down means not made redundant. It means that you've basically been told there's no work and that you're being stood down without pay, or it'll subsidise your wage if your employer is in distress. And they've defined that by if it's a small business or a medium business, 30% loss of revenue. If it's a big business, 50% loss of revenue.
And Sally, you're absolutely right that Labor and the union movement were campaigning for higher unemployment benefits well before this coronavirus outbreak, and also the wage subsidy. But despite these two wins, there are still a lot of people that we're worried about who aren't covered.
First of all, casual workers, and also there's a whole lot of workers that work. The nature of their job is intermittent. So you might think about people that work in the entertainment industry that might have like 3 months on because the show's on, and then a few months off. Construction is like that as well. And then, of course, there's all the casuals that would have expected to be working if it were not for the virus, that may not have been working 12 full months beforehand. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of young people that may have started work for the first time this year, or other people who've re-entered the workforce. So we've been advocating to the government that they need to change that criteria for casual workers, and a much better way of doing it is to say that if people would have expected to have been working, had a reasonable expectation of being working, if it were not for the virus, they should receive it. We'll see how that goes. The second group of workers are visa workers. A lot of those are New Zealanders, and they're covered now by JobKeeper, which is great. But that leaves about 1.1 million workers who aren't eligible for Job Seeker and won't get JobKeeper. And, actually whole parts of the economy have been running because of these workers. And now a lot of them have lost their jobs and they can't go home.
Sally, one of the stories that's come up lots of times, people contacting me saying that they've been asked by their employer to take annual leave, but they're still expected to work from home on that annual leave. That seems pretty extraordinary.
People need to know that you've still got the same rights at work now than you had a month ago before all of this started. So if you're on annual leave, you're on annual leave. That's time that you've got off that your employer cannot direct you to do work. If you're being paid and you're working from home, I guess it's the same thing. You're working, you're still on call, you still can be directed by your employer to do anything that's reasonable. But if you're sick, you're still on sick leave. If you're on annual leave, you're still on annual leave.
So Sally, we've also heard from a lot of people whose employer just basically won't talk to them about whether they're going to apply for JobKeeper, what it means for their job security and so on. What are their rights in that situation?
Well, this is a classic example about why people need to be in a union. If they're in a situation where their employer just couldn't be bothered or thinks it's too hard to apply for JobKeeper, and unfortunately a lot will, this is happening all over the place. Where people are in unions, we're negotiating with those employers. We're actually helping heaps of employers register for the JobKeeper allowance because we want, union members to be looked after. So if you're in that situation, the very best advice I can give you is to join your union.
You must be seeing a lot of these kind of OH&S issues right now.
I think the biggest issue is that issue of PPEs, or personal protective equipment. And so if you think about what that means in this circumstance, it's really things like gowns and masks if you're in a caring role, a frontline caring role. But then you even think about our police, our other frontline people, our people in supermarkets, they're actually on the front line too. You think about how exposed they are. But part of the issue is that we don't have a endless supply of PPE, and that's because we've sent a whole lot of our local manufacturing offshore over the years. And so what's happening is unions are working with the government and with employers to try and retool, which basically means like redesign factories so that they can make this PPE here. There's the issue of people working from home and mental health issues. So like lots of people will be more vulnerable at this time because of the social isolation. So your employer does have an obligation to keep you safe at work still. And then there's all the parents who are working from home, but all of a sudden have kids at home as well. So that's extra tough for them. And some of them really, the expectation that they're going to be able to work if they're not on annual leave is not really reasonable if they're also meant to be looking after their children.
You mentioned the personal protective equipment shortages, and it really is a great reminder of how important it is to be able to make things, to have a manufacturing sector in this country. Listen, Sally, I wanted to change the topic for a sec. The union movement and the big super funds have been really worried about the announcement that the government made that people would be able to draw down on their super, $10,000 this year, $10,000 next year. That's quite a big hit on your retirement income if you're a youngish person. I think if you're 35 and you take out $10,000 now, you'll be $100,000 worse off in retirement.
I don't think there's a broad enough understanding at all about how much you as a worker are going to be worse off if you take that money out now. And I would absolutely urge every worker to only do that if you have no other option. The JobKeeper allowance should make a difference to help people through. And you might think, well, I just need the money now. Well, you're going to need the money later as well. And you think about the difference between $10,000 and $100,000. It's just going to compound what is already problems with people, women and young people in terms of their super balances.
Sally, after the Depression came the Second World War, and we went from massive unemployment to a pretty strong labour market. And it strikes me that at a time like this, we need to be thinking about the future. No matter how hard the present is, we also need to be thinking about what sort of society and what sort of economy we want after this is all over. We already saw close to 2 million people who are unemployed or underemployed. We saw huge casualisation in our workforce. We saw a social safety net being chipped away at by the Liberals. What are your views on what we need to see coming out of this crisis?
It's such a good point, Tanya. A big crises, wars, pandemics will change society. It's around who takes leadership in making those changes. And for us, it's really clear that there's about three things that are really important. First of all, we have let casualisation go way too far in this country. Over the last 20 years, basically risk has been moved onto individuals. You've seen the rise not just of casual employment, but of labour hire, of gig economy work, of a whole lot of other work where people don't get any leave rights whatsoever. And when there's a problem, all the risk comes back to that individual. It's around 40% of Australian workers don't have any leave rights. We should aim to halve that. That's first. Secondly, the role of government. As we can see through this crisis, there's a whole lot of questions around, well, has privatisation gone too far? We really need our whole hospital system, not just our public hospitals, all working to capacity in the public good. So right across our economy, I think that there's questions to be asked around privatisation and around the important role of government in creating jobs and keeping people in employment as well. And finally, the other thing that's really exposed is the lack of manufacturing in our country, and that there's a very good case to be argued that it's so important for us to have local manufacturing, because as we can see now, we've got shortages of essential goods and services. We're an island and we're stuck without it.
So thank you so much for having a chat today. Thanks for all the great work you've been doing, and thanks to all of those people who've been active in their unions and working together to get through this crisis.
Thank you, Tanya. It's always great to be by your side.